It is difficult to comprehend children are being unwarrantedly or unlawfully removed from their loving parents by the state child protection agencies in Australia. And this film is not about the underground trafficking of children as described in the movie Sound of Freedom.
It is the fastest growing international crime network that the world has ever seen.
But the open and supposedly legalized system that trades and exploits children in Australia. The removing of children is deeply entrenched in Australian culture, and once a child has been taken, it is almost impossible for a parent to challenge a child department's decision. It's as if they have a no return policy. Public servants, medical professionals and judicial officers are ostensibly seduced into the default solution of removing children to supposedly keep them safe. They act in unison, often distancing themselves from compassion, rational forethought and the objectives of equity in the law. Australia has participated in the cruel business of taking, that is, stealing children for 3 centuries, and it's become a protection racket, a business that has very little to do with the protection of children. From around 1788, for about 80 years, Australia participated in the trade of importing so-called convict children from Britain and Ireland as young as 13. Australia was paid to take them, and children were expected to work on arrival. When this trade ended in 1868, 1 year later, in 1869, coincidentally, the focus turned to the First Nations people, with the Act to provide for the protection and management of the Aboriginal natives of Victoria. As one scheme abated, another child remove and replace program replaced it. In the 1920s to the 1970s, there was the Child Migrant Program, sourcing children from deprived families and sending them to the colonies. And often these children suffered lonely and brutal childhoods. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the community services sector in Australia experimented with foster care, with concerted publicity campaigns to recruit foster carers through the 1960s. I'm sure there were serious attempts to improve the lives of children in the general population, to phase out orphanages and institutions and children neglected at home. But like the old proverb, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Corrosive concepts and ideals would override good intentions into exploitation. Child protection had moved on from the First Nations to protecting all children. This was done for the care and protection of children, and this created the contemporary child protection systems we now know, where best interests of the child is the main principle. There were competing interests in the care of children. The Family Law Act of 1975 set out how to manage custody and child protection concerns in the federal family law courts. But through Section 69ZK of the Family Law Act, this allowed the state to override federal courts. When it comes to the operation of child welfare laws, this means that the lower children's courts have controlling interest in the trade of children. This will become clear later. The country was expert at stealing children, legally, and we refer to these children as being stolen. And even though in 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd gave a formal apology to the stolen generations, the removal of First Nations children has not ended. In the New South Wales Facts, that is, the Department of Communities and Justice Annual Report of 2019-20, under the section Children and Families Thrive, it states, during 2019-20, of the 2,206 children brought into care in New South Wales, 952 were Aboriginal children. And that is when only 3.4% of the people in New South Wales identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islanders in the census. We have heard of certain agencies going into Aboriginal communities and vacuuming up 20 to 30 children over a long weekend as if they were on a self-endorsed quota system. The Family Matters report released by the Secretariat of the National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare found 21,523 Indigenous children were in out-of-home care as of June 30, 2020. That is 1 in every 15.6 First Nations children living in Australia. That means 64 out of every 1,000 Indigenous children are in out-of-home care. The child departments use the law as governments did before them over hundreds of years to remove children, and they have the words protection and safety to guile you. The government's default solution for protection is to remove the child, and it is almost impossible to obtain details and reasons for why specific children were taken into care, as the child departments and children's courts operate in complete secrecy. Presently, there are about 50,000 children, that is, between the ages of 0 to 18, in state out-of-home care, which includes foster care, kinship care, and residential care. And the industry is growing annually faster than population growth. Obviously, there are children at risk. They might have drugged out parents or are surviving in a home that has alarming accounts of domestic violence, sexual assault, or neglect. But when children are taken from loving homes for no good reason, this results in a catastrophic ripple effect. It becomes generational. The children of parents who have survived the system will often become future clients of the system. The problem, too, is that the government turns out to be a bad parent over and over again. Their own statistics reveal children taken into government care are more likely to be harmed. Their families are disrupted and the child's potential stunted. It's like removing the child from the frying pan into the fire. A lot of people are making large sums of money through the culture of removals, and the system, regardless of its legality, can be maliciously cruel and dehumanizing. Many of us believe it is designed this way, designed to be cruel to children and families. And when public servants, judiciary act beyond their powers and/or unlawfully, they participate in exploitation or abduction. And this removal is often done in the most brutal and inhumane way, as described in this ABC article. This child protection trade or protection racket operates like a syndicate, with each person playing their role, and vulnerable parents are unable to comprehend the scale and ingenuity of the removals business. Once the department has possession of a child, it is easy for the lies and delinquency to compound. As one misstatement evolves into a complex fabrication, it becomes a rendition of Chinese whispers. Often department staff work as a relay team. The first caseworker that removed the child creates an accusation from a suspicion. For example, that the mother suffers from some undiagnosed mental condition. This first worker then passes the baton to the next caseworker, who inherits the spurious suspicion and modifies it into an assumption and treats the mother accordingly. After a year or so, when a third caseworker is assigned, the original suspicion has morphed into a fact that the mother has a mental condition, despite assessments having cleared her of any issues before. The forced removal of a child from a mother is traumatizing, as the natural biological and physiological bonds are severed. In so many cases, the action of the department that is removing the child is actually the cause of any parent's problems, like PTSD. This harm to the parent is then twisted later to justify separation and guardianship. By the time the matter is delayed and heard in court, the magistrate or judge is often offered a scrambled and deceitful account of the facts, and with his or her alignment with the removals culture, it is easy to justify awarding the child to the state. So in many cases, the magistrate or judge is just rubber stamping. The sheer might and financial resources of the government so heavily outweighs any parent and their rights. In other cases, the criminality is just blatant. Public servants from the police and the child departments will manipulate statements, write fake reports, conceal evidence, and perjure themselves to remove a child. I present evidence of this in detail in the book. The psych professionals also write reports to order, and no oversight body or APRA dares to crack down on the protection racket, i.e., the business of trading children. Australia is an expert at removing children from families, and it is by design. The Child Protection Racket aims to protect children from maltreatment in family settings, which includes all types of physical or emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect, negligence, and commercial or other exploitation, which results in actual or potential harm to the child's health, survival, and development or dignity. This may be true for some children, but unfortunately, it is the government that is emotionally abusing, neglecting, commercially exploiting, and exposing thousands of children to greater risk of sexual abuse when they remove a child from a loving family on hearsay or erroneous grounds. If a child discloses abuses, e.g. versions of rape or abuse, to his or her grandparents, parent, or to a psychologist or doctor, it is likely the child will not be believed by magistrates and judges. In many cases, the child's legal representative, the independent child lawyer, will go against the child too. Australia is a signatory to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which recognises the rights derived from inherent dignity, that everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be deprived of his liberty, in this Article 9, and all are equal before the law and entitled, without any discrimination, to equal protections of the law, Article 26. Article 9 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child ensures that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will. In state child protection laws, the safety of a child is of paramount consideration, but I now believe Australian children have no rights. They are not listened to, and they have little or no say on their lives. The convention and treaties Australia has signed to protect children are meaningless. A warning to any parents out there: if you report child sexual abuse in Australia, there is the likelihood that you will lose your children. You need to seek the right help. To the normal person, this sounds so bizarre and nonsensical. And if your newborn gets injured, it is very likely when you go to hospital, those good parents are accused of child abuse. In many cases, it is the default position, and I've spoken to some of these parents. The actions of forcibly removing a child from the parents are traumatic and disorientating, and the consequences of separating a child from a loving relationship are one of the most extreme forms of psychological abuse to that child. Would a young child's brain be able to distinguish a forced removal experience from a kidnapping? Pediatrics Professor Charles Nelson from Harvard Medical School in the USA spoke about this in the Washington Post. What separation from parents does to children, the effect is catastrophic, he said. There's so much research on this that if people paid attention at all to the science, they would never do it. Some children need rescuing, and removal might bring relief, but because some children were rescued from screwed up parents does not justify the extreme collateral damage to all the other children through this policy. Yet removal is the default solution of the government. They are using an extreme form of abuse to resolve the possibility of abuse. My book refers to the thousands of children that were screaming or pleading to remain in their home or placement. I contend the Australian federal and state governments are hooked on the service economy of exploiting children, i.e. the child removals business. Put simply, it's a jobs and growth industry, and it is now a multi-billion-dollar asset to the economy. I characterize it as a malignancy that erodes the very fabric of society through the destruction of family and father and motherhood. As a society, our leaders need to come to terms with this addiction to the protection racket and stop accepting cruel actions, flagrant corruption and malfeasance as normal operating consequences. Let me cite an example of how authorities did not protect but rather punished a child. This child I call Ella in the book had disclosed sexual abuse, that is, forms of torture, rape and hurt, by her father and others to a number of professionals over 3 years and in detail to a police officer. Nothing was ever done. It was Friday around lunchtime, and her father was to pick her up from school for a weekend visitation. Obviously frightened and realizing authorities were not helping her, the young girl then bravely spoke out to a new teacher detailing some of the harrowing details and an injury that she had recently suffered. The teacher was obligated to report the matter to CARL, that is, the Crisis Abuse Report Line. The policewoman who I've named in the book had listened to the worst sexual abuse disclosures a few months before, but she had lied in her entries that the child had made nil disclosures. But she was ready that afternoon and on the phone to the principal, urging that the child be sent back home with her abuser. It was only 18 months later it was discovered that she had concealed all of the child's sexual abuse disclosures. What happened to her? She was promoted. What happened to the teacher? I read a note that indicated the education department obviously considered that listening to the child's sexual abuse disclosures was distressing for the staff member, so I believe the teacher was offered counselling and time off. But what happened to the child? Ella was punished. She was ultimately removed through deception from her protective mother for bravely speaking out, and Ella has never been allowed to return home. Though many good people strive to help and protect children, on the flip side, there are the so-called protection apparatus. Others are emboldened within the system to exploit children because there is a monetary value in doing so. I believe tens of thousands of children have been betrayed by the state. This is a war against family and parents, father and motherhood to their children. From all the horrific accounts I've heard, I do not believe for a second in the fuzzy language from the government child department sites. Any Australian voter is familiar with the government mantra, jobs and growth. In 2007, the number of children in out-of-home care was 5.8 to 1 to every 1,000 children. This has now risen to 8 per 1,000. It's become obvious that the more children under state guardianship, the more jobs are created and the more tax required to deliver the ever-increasing salaries, services, fees and profits. And it seems First Nation families are easy targets. About 45% of the 14,723 children in out-of-home care in New South Wales are Aboriginal. The term child trafficking conjures up images of African children between the ages of 8 and 14 being trucked across the border to work in the cocoa plantations, for example. The worth of each child could be determined by the labour output, which might be valued at $5 to $8 a day. These earnings derive from the sale of cocoa. I suggest a more profitable option of trafficking children is through a sophisticated remove and place government program. There is no complex sale of merchandise, as the children are the merchandise. The income is sourced and derived from the taxpayer, and ingeniously there is no limiting factor for the industry, and the more children in the program, the bigger the budgets awarded. Each child brought in the system becomes an asset, a financial unit, as they are termed in the state financial books. It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry. One has to wonder why so many foster children, now adults, describe how they were moved from one foster home to the next until they finally exited the system. Was this because there's a broker's fee every time a child is moved to a new foster home? I have been told the fee is more under an emergency removal and could be as much as $30,000. Foster parents have a meaningful participation in society, but I have heard of the most horrific accounts from good foster parents, describing how the department removed their foster child or children under the most extraordinary and disgraceful circumstances, and how the children were greatly harmed, confused and humiliated by removing them from their caring foster homes. I detail this in a chapter called The Garbage Bag Children. Many mechanisms are in place to facilitate unwarranted removals from vulnerable or struggling parents. A vulnerable single mother might lose her baby at a birthing hospital with the department claiming of abnormal blood samples. Parents are reported to CPS for simply not presenting to a doctor before 13 weeks when pregnant. And parents can lose all their children because one child has a medical condition which the department claims is from abuse or neglect. These unwarranted removals make little sense until one considers these children are just merchandise to an industrial complex benefiting financially from a remove and place program, i.e. the trading of kids. Profits and salaries are justified and enhanced by expanding traffic in product, and many on big salaries. Many child advocates can name a number of psychiatrists that have made a career and a lot of money on maliciously advocating for the removal of children from good protective parents. It will ring a bell to those approximately 2,000 parents who have suffered reports from the most disastrous and unscientific nature from just one psychiatrist who cheerfully boasted his achievements on ABC radio. In many cases, every dollar expended by the government was a financial deceit. And who benefits financially by these actions of removal? Almost everyone. Department staff, from caseworkers, supervisors, team leaders, executives, anyone who prepared a continual stream of maliciously damaging court documents sprinkled with falsities that facilitated the agenda. Psychologists and other experts were assigned to write reports to fall in line with their removals program. The Attorney General's budget was harvested to pay the salaries of Crown solicitors, barristers, child lawyers, judges, and court costs. Just one person along this chain could have said, hang on a moment, a crime was committed to initiate all these actions, but no one ever does. It appears that people in the courts, some experts, psychologists, and a sector of the agencies act in the cruelest and most sadistic way. My inbox is filled with accounts and cases of children being harmed by the actions of government departments and courts, and where they are forbidden connection to those they love. Can you imagine that? Imposing brutal constraints to disconnect a child from the person they love, especially when these children in government care are in much more danger, 4 times more danger in fact. Do not get hypnotized by the pleasing, positive and affirmative language on the department's websites. The handwritten notes by children and the images and videos and recordings I've seen are haunting. Most of these are discarded by the courts, so please don't tell me that the mission to keep children safe and connected is working. And the lives of parents become so damaged by the process, which I call social purgatory. These parents, while challenging the government, are destroyed completely, psychologically, socially, financially, and professionally. They become shadows of their former selves. Australians can be proud of many things, but one statistic shrouds the country in deep shame. Australia is the gold medal winner in child sexual abuse, with one significant study noting Australia as having the highest reported rate for child sexual abuse of girls internationally at 21.5%. To fully understand child trading in Australia, one has to comprehend the statistics on child sexual abuse. There is a collective denial that is partly due to the media and ignorance, apathy and secrecy. There are now ads on television encouraging the reporting of child sexual abuse, but history has demonstrated that when a parent reports sexual abuse to protect their child or children, the likely outcome is that they will lose their children. Beware. The research does not support an assertion that young children disclosures are often false. This begs the question, why would the family and the children's and the youth courts deem most children disclosures as false, even if the children told numerous mandatory reporters? Judges and magistrates consistently ignore disclosures of rape, sexual abuse, and more. In essence, these judicial officers are calling these children liars. Imagine for a moment, for example, how courageous a sexually abused child has to be to tell a teacher, a doctor, a mother, a psychologist, and then a stranger of horrific experiences that are shameful. She hopes she will be protected, but the opposite happens. The system and the court often punishes the child. In family court, it is very likely the child will be ordered into the custody of his or her abuser. In the state courts, it is highly likely the child will be appropriated from the care of the protective parent and placed into state care. In my 2018 Gumshoe News Family Court Survey, in question number 7, I asked, who did believe your child when she or he disclosed sexual abuse? 58 of the 71 responders said family members did. In the survey, those charged with protecting the children and ensuring their rights were shown to be the most likely persons to discount the child's disclosures and their experiences. This does not align with the science. What is most revealing in all of this is the deliberate spoliation of evidence, the intentional, reckless, or negligent withholding, hiding, altering, fabricating, or destroying of evidence relevant to a legal proceeding. Even judges ordered parents to destroy evidence of sexual abuse without that evidence ever being tested. Surely this is potentially placing the child back into harm's way. I hope you begin to see how irrational the protection in the court system is. There's a deliberate apparatus to suppress child abuse in this country. Nothing makes sense in child protection unless it is viewed in the lens as a business. The science demonstrates that taking children unwillingly from their biological mother or father based on innuendo or hearsay is tantamount to torture. The outcome is a system that dispatches both mother or father and child to a disrupted life of social impoverishment. I can say now that having a child ripped from your care unwarrantedly by authorities for many is a living death experience. It is possibly the worst thing that you can do to a human. Do you remember the scene in Sophie's Choice when the Nazi officer forces a mother, played by Meryl Streep, to decide which child is going to be sacrificed or given up? She decides, and as they drag her daughter away, you are witness to the blood-curdling cries of despair.
Ich schicke sie beide darüber.
Nein!
Halt's Maul, halt. Hör auf jetzt. Du sollst das Maul halten. Los, entscheide dich, wähle.
Nein! Zwingen Sie mich nicht zu wählen. Ich kann nicht wählen.
Ich schicke sie beide darüber.
Ich wähle.
Nehmen Sie beide Kinder weg. Ja, siehst dich! Los!
Nehmen Sie meine Kleine!
Los!
Nehmen Sie meine Kleine! Nehmen Sie das Mädchen! Nehmen Sie das Mädchen!
Those cries happen every day, many times a day, in Star Chamber courts and in department visitation centres across the country. On the evening television news, we have witnessed a mother pleading to the public to find her lost child. Millions feel empathy and compassion. Her emotional distress and her crying and pleading through uncontrollable sobs is seen as acceptable. No, we expect this type of reaction from a distressed parent. But when a mother loses her child to the government, firstly, she is forbidden to go public. Secondly, if she shows her distress, sobs or cries out, this is used against her. They say, Your Honour, the mother's outbursts of emotion distressed her child, and she is unable to remain calm. We have assessed her as unstable. It is a parent's instinct to protect. It is in our DNA, so can you imagine the torment of isolation and despair when they are forbidden contact and are no longer able to protect or nurture their children?
Perhaps it was appropriate that it was Friday the 13th when a family court referee in Lansing, Michigan, issued an order to take breastfeeding baby Bree away from her mother Maria.
I can't, even the prosecutor didn't think it was the right choice to take our baby away.
With it at VHS. I'm bringing everything to you.
You want to go get a diaper bag and stuff so we'll have everything with her?
I'm gonna take her.
You're stealing the baby?
Sir, they have a court apprehension order signed by a judge to take the child.
You said I can't
That's all
go to
there is, okay? If they want to leave without anything, they'll leave without anything. They're willing to give you guys an
It's a point that probably many of you don't really know all that much about and maybe don't care about yet, but it will drastically affect the future of the human race and the overall condition of life on Earth. The powers that be can get rid of human motherhood. They're going to get rid of the sacred feminine, the idea of the sacred mother, the divine mother. This is something that's been passed down from culture to culture. It is something that has been a fundamental building block of a healthy, happy, and successful human life. In the mammalian model, a mother's love is essential to any healthy species. You see this with the most vicious of predators, whether it be a lion or a tiger mother. They still lavish love on their offspring. And the human being's ability to love is what really separates us from the other species.
It appears that magistrates and judges in children's and youth courts are subservient to the department and the child removals industry. It's a star chamber, with the department essentially facilitating a lucrative human trafficking service industry, which discourages and constrains ministers and oversight bodies from intervening. I'll read a short extract from my correspondence to the Chief Justice in July 2022. It's a punishing account of one magistrate, and although I was told he was a good man, it appears that once these judicial officers enter youth court, they seem to operate on a different legal frequency. I wrote to the Honorary Chief Justice Caracas, "Your Honour, I've written to you about this case over the last few years. What happens at 75 Wright Street is unbelievably wrong. I'm writing about the same case, but so many are similar. The mother has federal sole custody of a child, but the youth court magistrate, whom I name in the book, has now ordered forced separation until the child is an adult, on malicious speculation. He's robbing the child of the one she loves most in the world, her mum. I have to point out that the youth court is nothing but a star chamber, running along the lines of the court of Oya and Termina of 1692, using the equivalent of spectral evidence and pure speculation to convict a protective parent to a life of hell. In this instance, the magistrate acted so far beyond his powers with such error and irrationality that no reasonable person could ever arrive at his conclusion. The case is just truly diabolical and nothing more than abduction of a child, Section 80 of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act, as she was removed by deception. I've remained in the background and mostly silent for nearly 4 years, waiting for the wheels of justice to be delivered, but it seems that this is not possible in youth court. I can definitely state that this case is only the tip of the iceberg. Where does one begin on how a court rules? Magistrate K, in his judgment, made errors in law, based his reasoning on illogicality and legal unreasonableness, using defective arguments, acted with bias and beyond his jurisdiction, violated his statutory obligations and the paramountcy principle. The judgment is fundamentally defective. It failed to serve process where service of process is required. It seems the youth court is unable to deliver justice and therefore is not a court. I believe the system is past redemption, not because it is a failed system, but because it was designed to do what it does. The toxic mindset of removals amongst many public servants, executives, ministers and commissioners is so deeply entrenched that it has become standard issue for them, i.e. it has been normalized. Cruelty has been normalized. It has become commonplace to punish the child by removing him or her when a parent is suspected or accused of something that cannot be demonstrated or even proven. It's the present-day version of the Salem witch trials. How can one consider it in the best interest of the child when 3 officers forcibly grapple a desperate screaming boy or girl from the person they love deeply, and then subject to that child to the extreme form of psychological abuse of separation for the remaining of their child and teen years? Is this a sign of a mentally sick society? It's also a crime to emotionally abuse, psychologically harm a child. But in so many cases, when the government becomes the parent or guardian, it is the department that causes the harm and psychological trauma. The default thinking is to remove children from the frying pan into the fire. However, it is known and accepted that children in out-of-home care or foster care are in more danger of being raped or abused and more likely to have social challenges and face poorer lifelong health consequences. The criminal and axe murderer has more legal standing than a protective parent, and the child has no legal protections at all. The child and parent caught up in the child or infant removals racketeering business are dealt a brutal blow. The law, the country and its leaders have completely abandoned them. Everything is done to keep them apart, and no expense or misappropriation of funds is spared to do so. And no outsider is privy to the secret machinations of the star chambers. When the spider's web slowly cocoons them, you cannot disclose anything about this case. This is for the privacy and protection of your child. The secrecy laws are principally there to protect the actions of wrongdoers. Children's court is like a twisted game. a wheel of misfortune.